started. Let's do introductions today. We will start here in the boardroom, and then we can do introductions online, so we'll know who's with us today. I'm Deanna Jackson. I'm the Executive Director for Tri-County Water Authority, and we'll go to the right and go around the table.
Okay, my name's Stacy. I'm the Administrative Assistant.
Gray Wall on the Tri-County Water Authority Board.
Mike Nordstrom, Angela Water District.
Yeah, I'm Steve Jackson on the Tri-County Board.
Great, and we'll go to the people online. Stacy, if you could just call their first name, and then they can unmute and introduce themselves.
Okay, well, I'm going to start with the phone number ending in 3675.
That might be me, Tim Kelson, BLM.
Tim Kelson, okay,
Great,
very
thanks,
good.
Tim.
Julie Allen.
This is Julie Allen, Graham Osborne Ditch Company.
Okay, Amir.
Mayor Hussein, I'm with Geosyntec. We are the consultants for the Tri-County Water Authority.
All right, Brian.
Hi, Bryant Platt. I'm your Sigma point of contact with DWR.
All right, Cody.
Hi, Cody Colbert, Chevron USA Incorporated.
Coyote.
Yeah, Coyote Kadara in the community of Allensworth.
Morning.
Molly.
Hi, Molly Thurman with Hancock Farmland Services.
Ren.
Ren Akiona, Watershed Coordinator for the Tule Basin.
Stacy Ann.
Stacy Ann Silva, New Current Water and Land.
And Tim Kelson.
I think got Tim.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He was the phone number. Sorry about that, Tim.
Yeah, no, I'm listening on the phone because I couldn't get my audio on my laptop to work.
Happens all the time.
Feeling.
Thank you everybody for attending today, and we'll get moving and move right along through the agenda. And just so anybody who hasn't participated in a while or is new, it's an open forum. We welcome comments and suggestions, and there's not we don't have a large group, so you can just unmute and ask to be heard or raise your hand, and we will get you in and your comment. So with that, we will move to 2A, the Tule Subbasin update. And Amir, if you could start that update, please.
Yeah, so a couple of things on the Tule Subbasin. If each of you recall, on the annual report that was submitted to the DWR back in April, the change in storage number, which we had previously mentioned to this group, was a rather high number, and none of us felt that number was actually representative of what was going on across the subbasin. Even Tom Horter, whose group put together that value, felt that was an over estimation of exactly what that change in storage was. So using some additional data provided by the individual GSAs, there's a lot of wells that the GSAs monitor that are not representative monitoring sites that are reported to DWR necessarily or uploaded to the Sigma portal. And so the GSAs then provided that information to Tom and his group. They went through and recalculated that change in storage value, and it came down substantially. It was an order of magnitude change. And so the new value across the Tule Subbasin now is about 180,000. It's about 183,000, I think. And so they have prepared acre feet. They have prepared a letter to an addendum to the annual report that is going to get uploaded to the Sigma portal. In fact, I'm not sure if they may have already done it by now, Deanna, but that is going to get uploaded. And that is, I think, a much more realistic value as to what is actually happening across the subbasin as opposed to the previous value. What Tom has not provided us just yet, he's still going to do that, is how much of that 183 is actually in Tri-County. And so, you know, we're looking forward to seeing that number. I think, you know, I think that's more in line. Again, the total value is more in line with what we were expecting across the sub-basin. So I'll pause after each one of these because they're kind of unrelated issues, but I wanted to make sure that you guys everybody's aware of this. You can, and if anyone has any questions, please just ask me. The other thing related to that very topic is we have had several discussions with Four Creeks and Tom in particular about making sure that in the future that those reports are available for review with a much more, you know, in a more timely manner. And they have provided a schedule for the Thule side now. I think if, you know, as long as everybody sticks to that schedule, that will give us a chance to review that. In fact, there's enough time in there that's very likely that we'll have time to share the draft document with this group and obviously with the board and be able to talk about these values before they're reported to DWR rather than after the fact. So that was a big step. In our previous board meeting for Tri-County, we meaning Geosyntec presented to Tri-County a schedule for the Tulare Lake side. We're preparing the Tulare Lake annual report, and it's set up in a way that's going to give both this group and the Tri-County board an opportunity to see the values before they're reported to DWR. And I just think it's kind of important that you guys kind of see what's happening, what the changes are, what's actually being reported to DWR, and give you a chance to comment on that and better understand you know, what that change in storage values are and what progress you know, we've made against our GSP and what we're telling DWR is that progress and how that's being represented in the document. Dan, I'll give you a chance to add anything if you want to before I move on.
The only thing I would add is that we also made comment on the model update report, and Tom's group met with the consultants and we provided comment, and they did provide us with clarifications and made changes, and it was a good process, and I hope that it made the report just a little bit better in the end. So that was a smooth process, and we appreciated Tom Harder's group working with us on that model update.
Can you just clarify that, Mayor, maybe Deanna too, on what we were commenting on, so everybody knows what we're concerned with?
Yeah, so Steve, in one of the previous meetings, we had presented some of the questions that we had seen raised based on Tom's model report. So this was the updated model. And just for the sake of everybody on the call, we kind of went through and we reviewed it. And a lot of our comments were frankly just asking Tom to expand upon where some of this, you know, what was the actual new data that was used and how it was used. So we felt like the report presented a lot of the results, but it didn't necessarily have the steps of how he got there. And I think Tom certainly went back and added a lot of information that I think is going to be very useful moving forward as to what data sets that were actually used and how they were handled in the model. So, and we also kind of felt like, if you remember, it wasn't just really an update. It was a fairly substantial revision to the model. And so we felt like calling it just an update and having a short report probably, you know, was not sufficient for each of the GSAs to really understand how, you know, all of the changes that were made in the model. And I think, as Deanna said, you know, we were quite pleased with the changes that Tom made to the revised report. He clearly took our comments to heart and addressed most of them, you know, completely in that updated document that he prepared. So I think when DWR gets this document, it'll be a lot more comprehensive, and it'll make a lot more. It'll include a lot more information for them as well. Did I answer your question, Steve, or did you want me to elaborate on anything in particular?
No, I mean, I know their concern was how was the data going in there. So I think, again, I know we've talked about subsidence. I know will be a bullseye when we get comments back from the department. So, you know, Carter's, some of the stuff we're a little concerned about how it's modeling the subsidence here on the west side of the basin. You know, so we just have a work cut out for us, Amir, continuing to work on our subsidence issues within Tri-County and our neighbors around us.
Right. So that was one of the other things, Steve, kind of is a good segue. As you're all aware, the DWR is starting to send out comments on some of the GSPs. We have not received our comments, and we're still waiting for those. But we certainly would expect for not just you know, Tri-County, but for the surrounding areas that the subsidence issues are going to be brought up in those comments. And Steve, so one of the things we did ask Tom to do in his write-up was to address the fact that the subsidence that is occurring is going on through a multi-basin and needs to be addressed as a multi-basin issue rather than just focused in on just a Tri-County. And I understand his model was limited to Tri-County, but we just, you know, we modified, or we asked him to kind of modify some of that language a little bit to, you know, to show that it is a bigger regional issue that, and then certainly it has some, you know, some impacts to Tri-County.
Hey, Amir, it's Mike. On the comments that DWR is releasing, are they focusing on the high-profile, you know, subsidence areas, or is it just kind of a random, you know, response that they're giving out? You know,
no, so Mike, the four that they've released comments on so far have been on the Central Coast, and so they're, you know, the subsidence issues have not been a concern for them. I would imagine as we start getting more into the valley, and as we start especially getting down into this portion of the valley, that, you know, that we would expect something along those lines. But the comments that DWR has released to date, it's very clear that they've gone through the documents in detail, and they have checked them against each of the items that they were expecting in there. And in many cases, or not in many cases, but in these two cases, if they felt that something was missing or not elaborated on, or in some cases, if they felt like something was just being pushed out 5 years, they actually came back and said, you know, you have enough data to address this issue now, and we would expect to see a sustainable management criteria that matches the data that you have. And so they clearly went through these things in detail, and are much more focused on how you're addressing the undesirable results rather than just meeting a water balance. You know, I think a lot of us got very focused, you know, 2 years ago when these documents were being prepared, and none of us have a crystal ball. So this isn't a criticism, but I think all of us were kind of focused in on water balance. You know, what do I need to get the sub-basin into a water balance? And we did a lot on the models and everything else. And I think DWR has made it clear that their focus is really on those sustainable management criteria and preventing those undesirable results.
Thanks.
Okay.
It's still, if you're in balance, though, you're taking care of your undesirable results. It's still critical to to bring in water that you're extracting to replace it.
Deanna, do you want me to talk a little bit about the Tri-County? I think that was the sub-basin as a whole.
Sure, did you want to mention the new deputy director?
Oh, yes. So the new deputy director for Sigma at DWR is a gentleman named Paul Goslin. Paul was previously with Butte County, and Paul was our client for the work that we have been doing up in Butte County for the last year and a half. And so we have a very strong working relationship with Paul. We think that's going to be a huge positive for Tri-County in this area. Paul is a very reasonable guy. He's very level-headed, very smart, articulate, person, and I think he's going to be a good fit for Sigma. He understands Sigma. He comes from a basin that has a fair amount of ag across it, so I think that's important. He's been working with the ag communities for some time. So yeah, we were sorry to see Paul leave Butte County because we enjoyed working with him, but we were excited when he got this job here at DWR. I think it's going to be a good fit for the department, and I think it's going to be something that is going to be important moving forward with, as we start to implement Sigma. And we have like I said, we have a good working relationship with Paul. So if we do need to set up some meetings or anything else with Paul and his staff in the future, we've got good connections up to the main guy now. Yeah, we're excited. Bryant, you want to add anything else about Paul? Did I miss anything with him taking over, or any restructuring else?
I don't really have anything to add to that. That seemed like a pretty good introduction.
But Stephen Springhorn and others are still there. They're back to doing the jobs that they were doing previously, and are critical people in the whole process, which and I think that's a pretty good group that DWR has up there now.
What is Stephen's position right now? Stephen Springhorn. What did he move in? What's his title now?
So I don't know his exact title, Steve. Brian, I don't know if you know that one off the top of your head, but he is still, he's directly below that deputy director. So
he would be like an assistant, maybe too.
Yeah, I don't know his exact title, Brian. I don't know if you have that handy.
I don't have it handy. I can find a few seconds and drop it in the chat for you though.
Yeah.
But you said the whole team's still there. They
yeah.
Any more.
Yeah. So
seems like we have had a little bit of turnover there, so we're hoping that we stay through the planned comment period, that we keep that upper management in place. That would be helpful.
Yeah. The only last thing I'll mention very quickly across the sub-basin, and I probably should have said this while we were talking about the model, when we do get the comments, the expectation is if you get them before January, those will be some initial comments from DWR for consultation purposes. And then come January or so of 22, those will be the comments that we'll actually need to respond to. And at the last meeting, DWR certainly indicated that they would be issuing one set of comments for the sub-basin. And so we'll have to figure out, this is going to be the challenge for Deanna to figure out how we're going to respond as a sub-basin back to those comments, which ones are going to specifically pertain and affect Tri-County, and then what our role in all of that is going to be. So those are some questions that we're going to have to answer over the next few months as we're, as DWR starts to release more of these comment letters. We start to get an idea of what the focus of DWR is going to be, and how they're going to expect a response from each sub-basin. So this is a good segue into the second part of the agenda, which is to talk very quickly about Tri-County and specifically about some of the items in Tri-County. At the last board meeting, Tri-County's board approved some additional scope of work for Geosyntec. One of those is to start getting, reviewing our GSP and start based on what we've seen from comments from DWR already, and start, looking at areas that we think we may need to address and start to figure out exactly how we're doing in terms of data collection and other things that we might need. So we're in the process of starting that effort. As we start to pull some of that information together, we'll be presenting it, back to the board, and then as appropriate to this group. We don't have any, we don't have any crystal ball, but we can certainly take a look at, what DWR is focused in on and then start to address some of those issues, as they affect Tri-County. The second item that the board approved as well was some additional funds to continue our efforts on C2V SIM modeling efforts, which are the larger regional models. It also gives us an idea, a good way to review some of the information that's in Tom's model. And so we are going to move forward with that. We are in the process of getting some of our team members back up and have some meetings, and I'm going to continue to work, through Deanna and this group on, as we start to do some more information and start to move forward on some additional C2V SIM model runs. So there's a lot more information and a lot more data that's going to be coming your way on both of those items that I just wanted to kind of give the heads up to the group as to kind of where we're at in some of the things that we're going to be focused in on over the next few months. In addition, there's also some projects work that we're going to be doing, which I'm going to get into in a little bit as part of the presentation that I'm going to give. I kind of feel like that'll flow a little bit better based on some of the other items that we're going to talk about. And that's it, Deanna. I think, is there anything else on Tri-County that you want to jump into the DMS system, the Basin Safe?
Yeah, we'll move down to that in a moment. I just would also add for Tri-County Water Authority, we're still continuing to meet with several sources on the Allensworth project, including we had a meeting on Friday with High Speed Rail and have provided them the project description and maps. So we're still working on that. And then before we leave section 2, we have on the line today, we have Ren. And Ren, I'm going to ask you to pronounce your last name again, Accione. And Ren, yes, Ren is the new Lower Deer Creek Watershed Plan coordinator, and I met with him yesterday, and I'm looking forward to working with him on projects in the Lower Deer Creek Watershed. Ren, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. Sorry we're running around. I think you might be getting some feedback from me.
Okay.
Yeah. So first of all, I think we've had some pretty promising discussions around what to do with some of these fallow lands. I've been pretty impressed, actually, with a lot of folks on this particular call about how open folks are for different fallowing strategies and prospectively restoring some of these grounds. Overall, I think the general plan for us over the next 3 months is just to kind of take inventory in the Lower Deer Creek watershed and throughout the basin, start compiling sort of an internal database of what folks' conservation strategies might be, making sure that districts and GSAs aren't operating sort of disjunctively, and try to align things like disadvantaged community advantages, ecological advantages, and some of these land management practices. And so I know it sounds like a lot, but it has been a pretty aggressive learning curve, and yeah, just compiling as much information as possible.
Thanks, Ren. Sorry to put you on the spot. We've kept this on our agenda as we've moved along when Kathy was involved in working on getting the watershed coordinator grant money. And so we'll transition it now to you, and you can, on the advisory committee days that you're able to come, we're glad to have you, and you can provide the report on what's happening in the watershed. That would be fantastic.
Sounds great. Thank you.
So, Deanna, on that score, the bill that's going through on that land repurposing grant, so I'm not sure what we have to do to get our name in the hat. I have a feeling that bill will get passed.
So that's why we put it on the agenda. We want to get a general description down because we'd like to get it on the website so that we will be eligible for funding as it comes. So that's why we want to work on at least working on a general description of what we perceive may be just a skeleton structure of a program. It'll take time to develop something properly, but getting something that will help us be eligible for that funding is going to be important. So,
what was the bill, Mike? Off
the top of my, I can't remember the bill name.
Who was pushing
AB 252.
252. I was thinking 259.
AB 252. Okay. Who sponsored that 252?
What was the author's name? There's a number of people behind it, Steve.
What
But,
Solace up in the Salinas Valley is the main proponent of the bill.
Rivas.
It's Rivas, thank you.
Yeah, because I want to make sure too that it is a quote reservoir project fit that criteria for repurposing.
Okay.
So it's not just grazing or whatever. If we could fold that into one of our projects that we're looking at to build the project,
right,
would be great.
I reviewed a recent copy of the bill a couple days ago, and it includes considerations for multi-benefit recharge, water storage, things of that nature. As long as there's multi-benefits, it should qualify under the bill as it's currently drafted, but it'll likely shift around a little bit before it's finalized.
Yeah, so when we do our planning, we ought to look at like the Liberty and some of these other projects that we're talking about to get that teed up.
Yep, absolutely.
On the White Ranch too.
Deanna, I was going to say, if you're doing some conservation planning and mapping, the Cahuilla Subbasin recently is in the process of completing a regional conservation investment strategy plan. And there's some mapping data and some language that I think would be helpful for Tri-County, and it would just be a good resource. It's not published yet, but it will be, I think, in a week or two. And I can send you a link when it is published if that works.
That would be fantastic, Stacy. Thank you.
And just a general question on that, and perhaps Stacy Ann, you have some information, unless you've disappeared. You're on mute. In terms of the legislation and going forward and thinking about land repurposing and multi-benefit recharge, I'm assuming that it would be expected that each entity applying for these grants would have some kind of plan on offer that would include criteria for repurposing, maybe not exact locations, but at least criteria for repurposing. Is that fair? In other words, some forethought as opposed to kind of the scattershot, throw the spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks kind of deal?
Correct. One of the points of AB 250, one of the points of it is to avoid kind of that checkerboard land retirement that I think we all realize that nobody's really going to benefit from. There has been some talk, and I'm not intimately involved in the process, but GSAs or entities that do have kind of a strategic conservation plan lined out will be likely better candidates for the grant funding than an entity or public agency which hasn't really given a whole lot of thought into how they're going to create connectivity and things of that nature. So Julie, you're correct. A plan is not required, but it is absolutely helpful if you want to try and secure some of that grant funding.
Yeah, avoiding the checkerboard, the odd 5-acre piece here and there, avoiding something truly useless like that would be, I would think, very high on the list. Establishing connectivity, yes, that's kind of the other side of the coin. Actually far more difficult to do, but nevertheless essential. So I'm very happy to hear you say all that. Thank you, Stacy Ann.
Absolutely, and we kind of are just playing a bit of a supporting role for one of the proponents of the bill. So not intimately involved, like I said, but know enough about the process to be able to kind of answer some basic questions if anyone has them.
Very good. Are there any more questions before we move on? Okay, I will move on. I'll give it just a quick update on the data management system. I think all of the logins have been out, and we have now ET data through May in the system, and I suspect that June's will be in the system either the end of this week or early next week. First quarter invoices went out about 2 weeks ago. July 12th, and second quarter invoices are going to follow pretty quickly. They'll be out by mid-August, if not sooner. Again, if there are any questions from landowners on your invoicing, please contact us, and we'll work with you on that. And Stacy's been great. She's been working through some of the questions with landowners, and but that is where we are with the rollout. We're still working with Basin Safe. We meet with them weekly and go over any questions or concerns, and they update. They're still working on their system and updating it weekly with new updates to be helpful to all of the GSAs that are involved. And so it's been a good process, and I think it's an exciting program. I really like the map function. If anybody's on this call that hasn't looked at the mapping function, it's pretty cool. But that is where we are with Basin Safe. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Amir for the water accounting policy. And maybe I should just say a few words before we start on the water accounting policy. So while we were working in Basin Safe, Four Creeks came and said, hey, you really shouldn't put the sustainable yield in 5-year blocks. It should go in 1-year blocks. It's easier to track that way. And I went back and reviewed Tri-County's policy. Tri-County's policy says that we will credit that to landowners in 5-year blocks. When I started thinking about that, with how that would work out financially, considering this year, the first year, where some of that sustainable yield might get eaten up, so to speak, credit-wise, this is the year where all tiers of buckets of water are at $10 an acre foot. Next year, we move to the civil penalty, and so it might be something to consider changing the language in the policy to move it so that we are crediting landowners annually for sustainable yield, and that is what Amir is going to talk about this morning. So.
Well, I think you covered a lot of it, Deanna, but no, that's actually good. So there's, Deanna talked a lot about the from the side of that's the existing policy, and then as Deanna and I were continuing our conversations, the water trading issue came up as well. And as we were talking about water trading, we started talking about how long would a trade be good for. And so, as we're talking about those two issues, we're going back and we're saying, okay, should we do a year, an annual trade? Should we have the trades go longer? We realize that, okay, wait a minute, we're allocating this sustainable yield on a 5-year basis, but then we're talking about doing trades for some other potentially shorter amount. Maybe, the trade might only be good for a year initially. And so as we started having these conversations, we realized that we should probably get some input from this group and some recommendations from this group back to the board. Do we want, and so I know I'm talking about two different things, and I don't mean to confuse the issue, but if we're going to change the policy from that 5-year allotment, it's also potentially has the ability to affect how we write the water trading policy. And if we decide not to change it and keep it that 5-year allotments, then we probably need to look at the water trading policy and make sure that whatever final policy we have in place makes sense based on how the allocations are actually, how we're handling the allocation. And that's really what it kind of came down to was, as we were looking at this, we were like, okay, does it still make sense to do 5-year allocation? Again, we're only talking about the sustainable yield. Just want to be 100% clear on that. Or should we change it to, as Deanna said, to this annual, which would certainly then fit in much nicer to our trading policy. So that was where we were trying to figure out ways to reconcile these and make sure that everything, as we move forward, starts to match up. And so we wanted to at least bring it back to this group and have some discussions with you. I can show you, I don't think it's necessary, but the current policy, allocation policy basically says that, it's allotted in 5 years. And actually, Stacy, do you have the PowerPoint presentation that I sent this morning? I'm sorry, I'm working off this tiny little screen, and I don't know if all of you caught it, but we're literally in the process of moving our office today, and so our server and everything has already gone down.
Mayor, this is Graywall. I think the 5-year policy is very important on the initial rollout, but rules and amounts and information that you collect and adjust is going to change. So as we go forward after each 5-year increment, we'll be modifying what that is. So I think that's fine, but as a guy that's done a lot of trades, I think the trade's an individual trade that is the people got to perform and return that at a given time, because there's a lot of trades that go for quite a while.
They were probably never intended to come back.
So I don't personally believe that you should mandate what each individual trade is. They just have to perform.
Well, okay, so I'll just caution that when we're talking about these new groundwater markets, and we don't have a good analysis of what a trade result might be on undesirable results, so that it would be the reason for shortening the trade time limits initially, so that you wouldn't necessarily affect what we don't know yet, right? So if you were trading in 5 years, let's say 5-year chunks, or forever, and that trade went to a certain place, well, we don't really know what that undesirable result of taking out that trade in that place will be yet. So that would be a reason to make some limits, and then later on, once we have more data, we can open up to a larger.
I would think 5 years is reasonable. Put an outside limit on it.
But Mike, say you're doing a trade and you're only talking about shallow wells, so you're not really, what's defined in that trade as far as what's really being moved?
Right now we're not defining.
We're not.
We don't have anything defined. We're not to that level of detail yet. Right now we're just talking. I think the concern, that's why we want to tee it up at the stakeholder meeting, is get our landowners to weigh in and see how that because I think what Deanna's saying, we don't want to get in a position where we're going to have someone trade off their 5 years of safe yield, sell the property, you know, and then, I mean, we have to keep track of all that.
And then.
Or, like she said,
Unsustainably.
yes, that becomes unsustainable, the groundwater levels go down way too fast. So, I mean, I've looked at how this, to be clear, to be transparent, I looked at like where Sandridge is at, we got a large safe yield number, right? So we could do a lot with that number, but is it?
But you're also.
The question is, should we cap that on the trading to just a 1 year amount? We can give you 5 years of your safe yield, but should we go back? I think that's what we need to weigh out with that's why we have it in the stakeholder public meeting, kind of get some input from everybody and see what's going to work.
Your modeling is gonna provide some of that data, and that's why it was really important for Amir to move forward with that V2, the SIM.
Right.
The V2S modeling that the state's doing, because that's gonna provide a lot more data as we go through the first 5 years.
And again, the other consideration on the year versus 5 year allocation, now if we could just roll it back to the allocation of the sustainable yield credit, there is a financial difference for a landowner if they eat up in this year their sustainable yield, which is at a less expensive price, and by the time they start next year, they're already in tier 1. So, I mean, that's something that I saw.
Yeah, I was on a different way. I was thinking trading inside the basin on a longer term, but yeah, for somebody doing it, may make more sense doing your annual allocation, because I can see where somebody loads that up and boy.
Well, it's the same type of deal analogy as when we're looking at our carryover, and are we gonna use it up, or are we gonna carry it over?
Yeah.
And what do you wanna do?
Well, it was to Deanna's credit, it's something we adopted the policy, but then when we started to implement the policy, we realized there's a little bit of a nuance that we hadn't really considered, and that's why we're bringing it up. It's like, hey, you can run through your safe yield like this year. On some landowners may run through it. So
it is important to differentiate those costs, though, to where somebody's not playing a money thing on the tiers. That's different than saying, I'm saving a crop this year because I'm in a severe drought. And we're just rolling to see what happens next year to make it another year. But the cost needs to be adjusted, because you can't let somebody take an advantage. Oh, the last year I've got something at $10, and next year it goes to $150. I mean, that needs to be changed. Or that needs to be rectified. Especially on trading.
Right, and that's why I wanted to bring it to the landowners. I'm very interested in hearing from those on the call today, what your thoughts are regarding, moving it back to a yearly allocation versus this 5 year. And I think what you're hearing is the board's open to changing that policy if the landowners, if that works better, but, really this should be landowner driven. So does anybody have a thought on that?
I like Mike's 5 year, 1 year, I think, is too.
Well, but I was thinking on a different, pathway on the trading but I thought, when we went in, it was to give, if we go back to an annual allocation, then what do we do for a landowner that's saying, hey, I've got a project that I hope we're gonna have online in 2 years or 3 years from now, and if we only then give an annual allocation, we're really gonna pinch some people right out the start.
They still have their tier 1. There's nothing that they would still every year have the sustainable yield plus their tier 1 water, which is in a 5 year block. The tier 1 would still be in a 5 year block.
Yeah, I wouldn't limit the tools in the toolbox, though. I would broaden it as best you can and not have strict. Because what you're saying is it may stop a project.
I don't think we need to think through this.
Yeah.
I don't know if you had on your PowerPoint, was there anything you wanted to bring up for the group?
Could the group see the PowerPoint when we had it up there?
Sure.
You want to put it back up?
Yeah, Stacy has it.
Okay, we'll put it back up. Are you sharing the screen? I think I see it. Oh, okay.
And
I
while
was
the
gonna say, we
PowerPoint,
can't see the PowerPoint.
No, I didn't think so.
PowerPoint. That's the
while we're waiting on the PowerPoint, was the idea if we go back to annual allocations that those could not be rolled? Someone was mentioning like what happens if there's a project that takes a couple of years, and it sounded as though the entity who is embarking on the project wouldn't be able to accrue those credits.
No. So the only difference that we're talking about is taking either the credit right now, if you look in your Basin Safe account, you've been credited for 5 years of sustainable yield. And what we have in the policy is an order of use. So sustainable yield has to be used before you can go to transitional tier 1. So with that would mean, this year, if you were to use up 3 of your 5 years of sustainable yield, and then, let me think about that. Or if you were to use all of your sustainable yield this year, you would, basically next year, you would have none left for the next 4 years at the $10 per acre foot charge. You would be into the civil penalty immediately. So if you spread that sustainable yield allocation out over 5 years, every year you would have your sustainable yield allocation to use at that $10 rate, at the lower rate. That was my only concern in this topic, really. At this point, it really is up to the landowner. If you like it in the 5-year blocks, that's perfectly fine. That's in the policy, and it's currently in Basin Safe that way, and it certainly can't. It's not a harm other than possibly a larger charge to a grower over the next years.
If I'm understanding correctly, though, the growers are gonna pay that overage to get into the tier 1 water, whether it be in year 1 or year 5, right? So it's just they're paying for the cheaper water in the first year because of the policy.
So this year, if a grower was to hit tier 1, it would still be at $10 per acre foot because the civil penalties do not get put in place until 2022. But because of we've structured it where you have to utilize your sustainable yield before you move to tier 1. If in this year you used all of your sustainable yield, next year you would be in tier 1 at the civil penalty level. There would be no $10 per acre foot water available to you. If we moved it where next year you got a year's worth of sustainable yield, that water would still be available to the landowner at $10 per acre foot before you transition to tier 1.
The silence is just.
It's a marginal benefit.
It's a marginal benefit. You just run the numbers on it. You could quickly, if you do a spreadsheet, you could see what it means.
Yeah. And I'm not being facetious here, but it's going to be expensive either way. So I can't imagine the benefits being huge. Kind of tomato, if you will. I suppose if there is any financial benefit, then we might as well, pursue that avenue for the good of all growers. I don't see any harm in that. And even if it's saving a couple of pennies, those eventually add up. So that would be my 2 cents.
So I'm going to, if anyone else wants to chime in, I'm going to throw in a little extra wrinkle into this. And that is, and I don't mean to keep mixing up these two things, but the water trading policy, and I know many of you are going to be very interested in seeing what kind of water might be available, within the sub-basin as it makes sense. Because certainly as you start to use up your sustainable yield, you're going to be looking for some additional sources of water, potentially before you go into the tier 1 or something else is available. And so that's where I keep kind of getting back. There's if you're looking for water outside of the sub-basin, outside of the GSA, within the Tule sub-basin, the other managers have kind of made it clear that their policies are, hey, if our two policies match, then they'll allow for some of that, potentially allow for that trading to occur. So that that's one thing to keep in mind, that we, you know, if we are as a GSA, as landowners within the GSA, thinking that, hey, I'm going to be potentially trading for water outside of our GSA, then we want to make sure that those policies match up as close as we can, the water trading policies and the accounting policies. So that was the other, that, you know, that was one of the things I wanted to just throw out there and keep that in mind as we're kind of having this discussion. You know, does that impact your thoughts on, you know, because as Steve said, or as Molly just said, it may be a marginal difference if it was just a pure allocation and you were just, whether you got it in 5-year blocks or you got it in 1-year blocks. But does it affect your ability to trade, or does it make trading more desirable or less desirable depending on how you're allocated that water? I'm not sure I'm being very articulate with that, Deanna.
No, you know, there were a couple things we needed to hit on for water trading policy, and one is probably the amount of time a trade would be allowed. And initially, I think a shorter trade is better than a long-term trade until we have a good representative handle on what those trades mean. And so I think it doesn't matter what is allocated in the system for that. I mean, if we allocate on a 5-year process and then we decide on the policy that the trade's only going to be for 1 year, it's just simple math by parcel to know how much that parcel has for the year and could possibly trade. So we can do it both ways. That's not really of matter. And I was thinking, you know, in my mind on the trading issue, there's two different things. Sustainable yield in the Tule, we'll just talk about the Tule subbasin. Sustainable yield in the Tule subbasin with trading in intra-basin trading likely has to be traded within the Tule subbasin in order to trade with our partners. But as we talked about the last meeting, landowner developed credits, which may be a water banking project or a specific recharge project. Those would be landowner, in my mind, landowner credits, and those should be eligible to trade with the participating entities. So I think separating those out might be good when we have those discussions. But so let me ask. So Molly, you're pretty open. Do you want time to think about the 1 year versus 5 year?
I would prefer that, yes.
Okay. And you know, unfortunately, we don't have anybody from Gephardt on the line today. So what we'll do is maybe we'll throw this out there again in an email, what we're considering, maybe even the policy change that we would be considering, and then give the landowners an opportunity to think about that. If we were going to make that change, we would probably need to make it before the end of the year, before the end of the first year. After the end of the first year, I think that 5-year block is pretty much, that's the way it's going to be. It would be very hard to unwind that after the first year when the penalty fees come into effect. So if we're going to do that, we have about, you know, just a few months left to consider it. Amir, did you?
No, I think, yeah, Deanna, you kind of nailed it. We're just kind of looking for a recommendation back from this group. Does it make sense to keep it the way it is, the current policy, or would you prefer that we, you know, make a recommendation back to the board to change that policy? We want to do what makes the most sense for the landowners and the you know, and the growers in the area. And if, you know, and so that's what we're looking for is your input on that and your recommendation back to us and then eventually back to the board for their consideration.
I think we gotta hear from the landowners first. Huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, I'm sorry, I'm going to keep beating this dead horse, but as you're at this point, I'm probably having to dig up the corpse of the horse to beat it some more at this point. But as you're considering that trade, or as you're considering that how you would like that allocation to occur, please keep in mind and think about how you want the trading market and the rules that are going to govern that trading market. So as we start to allocate, we want to make sure that the rules match up and make sense and work in the interest of the of the landowners. There's a consideration of whether if the trade is short term to start with, it keeps an active market going. Potentially right now, if you have it, without those types of rules in place, you could go in and most of the available water might be locked up within that first year, and it might not have much of an active market in the next over the next 4 years or so until a new allocation is made. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at trades and what you would like to see as the rules for the trading market. We're looking for your input on, if you want an active market, then the shorter term trades probably make a lot more sense to start with. If you're really just looking to say, okay, hey, look, I've got these permanent needs for this water, then maybe that's, a market isn't so much, is not that important to you. It's more of just the ability to make that trade, and then you can lock up that water for some extended periods. But from both a buyer and a seller standpoint, think about what makes the sense for a market. Do you want it, is this something that we want actively to occur every year, or is it something that, occurs on an as needed basis?
Yeah, I think we need to be clear on, because where I got confused is trade. I have the context that we're trading credits and somebody may be giving you surface water back in some period of time versus saying the context we're talking about is really a sale of the credit.
Yeah, it's
It's a one-way deal, two-way.
It's just groundwater credits only, yeah.
Yeah, Mike, that's right. It's groundwater credits. It's really focused on groundwater credits.
Yeah, and the other GSAs within the subbasin, they're the Eastern Tule is a little more open, but Pixley and Lower Tule have put quite a bit of parameters around what they're willing to trade and to be traded in, and they have numbers, monthly, yearly amounts that can go in and out on those groundwater trades. I think maybe in the respect of doing it in short trades, like a year's worth of trade, in some respects, for Tri-County's purposes, probably takes care of that initially. It'd be very difficult to trade off large amounts if you can only trade a yearly amount of your allocated groundwater. So anyway, that is a couple things to think on and to get back to me. I think the sustainable yield and 5-year block is probably the most pertinent issue. And we're still working with the subbasin on trading rules. I'd like to see a subbasin-wide study, but I haven't been able to get anybody to bite off on that yet. I think it would be really good if we kind of all were on the same page. But we have people within the subbasin that are just not even interested in trading credits at all at this time. So it's we're kind of the Wild West, making up our own rules and then trying to mesh them together still. Well, and
When you say that, Deanna, are you talking about even in their own boundaries or the whole coordinated boundary?
There's two GSAs that just they don't you know, for Galena Early Mart, they're not allocating because their water balance is imbalance. And so there's no allocation. And I don't believe that Alpha GSA has an allocation either. And with no allocation, there's no trading. So
The rest of us are looking at Eastern Chile, Pixie, Lower Chile, and us are looking at trading, allowing that credit to be traded within the GSA. It's just what we're trying to do, what Deanna's trying to bring up with the managers is trying to enter GSA within the sub-basin trading. And that's somewhat problematic right now.
yeah. So everybody, the way we've structured it right now is each individual GSA comes up with their own rules, and then we're going to try to mesh them together. I think, you know.
Like we have Standards has a lot of credits somewhere in Lower Chile. How do I get those back over here? Not easy.
So that is the policy that we're still working on and still looking for input on as well. And with that, we could probably, go ahead, Amir.
Oh, no, I was just going to add to what you know, I was agreeing with what you said there, Deanna. I think, you know, a water trading policy is a big thing to bite off, and I think our approach is going to be maybe to try and do it in smaller increments with you guys so that we can bring up, you know, specific issues and talk through them. And as we start to develop this, I understand that you probably want to get it developed quickly. As some of you would like to see some of the, you know, the trade happen, you know, as early as this year. Again, talking about groundwater trading, but I also want to make sure that you know, we consider the appropriate amount of rules for that this group would recommend and get all of those incorporated into the policy.
It just seems like as we go forward building projects, especially if you have joint projects between GSAs or you build a project in somebody else's backyard, you're going to have the flexibility to, you know, trade those credits out of that backyard.
Agreed.
Yes, agreed.
I don't know how else
that's part of what we're going to continue politically to work on within our sub-basin.
But that's to their advantage too, because there's going to be a leave behind.
Yeah.
You know, so I don't know. Be short-sighted if they don't do that.
Yeah, this is an example that I bring up quite often when I'm talking to people. It would be great if you were bought into a project, say where Tri-County paid for recharge along the Bryant Kern, or put recharge along the Bryant Kern, and then the landowners in Tri-County were able to take those water credits out where it wasn't causing damage to infrastructure, right? So those type of, you know, it just kind of makes sense to have a project like that. But right now, we don't have the policy in place to do that within the sub-basin. So, you know, we want to see, Tri-County doesn't have the recharge area, and I say this at every meeting, it has some disadvantages in where it's located, right? And so if we had the projects upstream, and we were doing the recharge upstream and then taking credits downstream, and maybe that's not one-to-one, but the credits downstream with the growers downstream, we got to get there with the policy eventually. But starting with true groundwater trading credits is a place to start, and so if we can build that policy and get some agreement within the sub-basin, then we would have a starting block.
Good.
With that, we should probably move real quickly to land repurposing, Amir.
Yeah. So this gets into the discussion that Stacy Ann and I think was talking about, and actually, I'm kind of glad that she brought it up, because it helped bring up a lot of different issues. So the land repurposing and you know, the whole idea that we are talking about this now is, as Mike and Stacy said, that potential bill is out there. We want to make sure that from a Tri-County standpoint, we want to make sure that if that funding is available, that we have a plan in place to be able to pursue some of that. And we want to make sure that, you know, it is something that is possible for us. And so as we were looking at this, there's two items here. There's the immediate short-term issue of this potential funding coming up over the next year or two. And then there's the longer term issue of, as we have to get down to our sustainable yield values, what is going to be our policy towards that land repurposing? And by repurposing, I mean a whole slew of different ideas. I'm using that term to encompass everything from taking land out of production for environmental purposes, all the way to commercial enterprises, to include some type of land retirement policy as well. So I'm using this just as a catch-all phrase for everything that, if we take land out of production, what happens to it? And that is something that as a GSA, we need to consider. A lot of GSAs that we're working with in the area, nobody likes to talk about land retirement, but it is a possibility, and it is something that we should start to consider as part of our plan. And that's kind of what I wanted to bring up to the group was, this kind of two-phased approach where we've got the immediate issue of this potential funding that might be available, and how we want to write the plan for that, and depending on exactly how those funds are going to be made available. And then the longer term issue of what is some of this potential land, how do we write policy to handle how that land gets repurposed, not just in the short term, but 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, and how do we make that how do we to maximize the value for the landowners, maximize the value for the for the community and the surrounding community. So there's a lot of thoughts about that, and so one of the ways that we'd like to approach this is to start to put together a straw man ideas, and then run that by you at the next meeting, and start to think about at least some initial thoughts, put them on paper, and then make that available for this group. If anybody has an example or a white paper or some other documentation that you think we should consider as we're putting together this initial draft, please make that available to myself and Deanna, and we'll make sure that to take a look at that and see if that's something that makes sense for Tri-County.
Yeah, Mayor, on that specific note, there's a white paper that EDF put together in March of this year on advancing strategic land repurposing and groundwater sustainability. So I will send that over to you if you haven't already seen it. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I heard about it. I haven't actually read it. So yeah, that'll be good to see exactly what EDF has on that.
And when we start talking about putting together a conservation plan, which I think that is a good idea, considering where the location is. I mean, we are located between the Kern and Pixley refuges. There is a natural connection there. We do have the Apple Island Wetlands Project in there, as well as the NRCS wetlands at the end of the Deer Creek channel. So connecting lands with those should be a natural process, and something that we want to think through. I think we want to caution. We don't want to feel any landowner to feel like we're targeting them. We want the landowners to want to be involved and included, and feel like their input is very important, because it's not the intent of a GSA to push anybody out of production. But we also know that water is going to be scarce as we move through SGMA, and 20 years from now, there'll be a lot less available than there is today. So we want to start thinking about how we can structure something that's beneficial and not burdensome. But again, I don't see this as being something we have to sprint towards necessarily, but I do want to make sure that we have, something, like I said, skeletal design that we can put on our website and then at least be eligible if funding comes available. So that is the purpose right now. And I do want to bring in partners, conservation partners. I see that as a good way forward, and I know others have done that. So we'll be looking at that direction.
Yeah, Deanna, just for clarification, should have mentioned the white paper EDF put together was done after a series of 3, ended up being 4 workshops with stakeholders from agriculture, California government, all of that. So it's not just a document EDF put together, and I've sent that to you, Amir.
Great,
Okay,
thank
great.
you.
Just like you mentioned, I was going to say too, we have so much around us with the BLM land. We are, I think Tri-County is strategically located to help make smart, I would call it smart repurposed neighborhood strategies. And I like the word, I think that's got to be changed in our phrase, we're not going to call it fallowing.
Right.
We can call it repurposing. No farmer likes to think about fallowing his land.
Right.
We got to keep that terminology straight, Amir. We need to keep that as a repurposing. Just
Yeah,
like
absolutely. No, I agree,
PDF
Steve.
PDF paper is on repurposing. I think that's very, very important term.
That's clever, Steve. That's what we say in the dairy business when we send a cow to beef.
Yeah. Well, John, I don't know what else to say.
We're repurposing it.
I know, it's painful no matter what we do here, but it's, you're right. It's just words. It's just words.
I thought that was harvesting, Jeff.
Yeah, well, we all know what it is, but I get you.
Yeah.
Molly, have you been involved in any discussions and other GSAs? Are they putting forth any repurposing programs or starting those discussions that you can speak about?
Sorry, what were you asking for?
I'm so sorry, Molly. I said, have you been involved with other GSAs that are beginning to discuss any type of repurposing program or fallowing program, or that you could discuss? Or
I'm going to say generally everybody is really trying to optimize the water market situation and what that looks like for them. The discussions I was going to say land repurposing is really a last case scenario. And so most of them haven't really gotten to discussions there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. But I will say that's not to say it's not like on the agenda or on the radar in different places. I just think the bulk of people's efforts right now is going into crediting systems and accounting frameworks and project development and kind of media mitigation with the drought, if you will.
Just to echo what Molly said on that, a lot of GSAs are just kind of behind where you guys are in terms of allocating and all of that. I see Amir smile. That makes him feel good, I'm sure. But
Well, it wasn't easy, Stacey. Yeah, it's not easy.
I've been watching long enough to know that's true. Again, the regional conservation investment strategy effort in the Cahuilla subbasin was largely a land repurposing conversation. And so it was a way to use a state program and state funding to kind of guide that strategic planning effort. And so, yeah, I'm a broken record today, but this is a place I've done quite a bit of research and effort. So I would say looking to that plan, which just basically just identifies species and areas, is probably a place to start kind of once you get established what you're looking to do as a framework for how to do it or what next steps you may need to take.
You know, Stacey, also, the blueprint process is focused on some of these multiple uses of land too. So it'd be great if we could get everybody we're all working towards the same. I know we're working towards the same thing, but if it's coordinated, it would be very helpful. Yeah,
the proponent of the Cahuilla RCIS is actually East Cahuilla GSA, which is involved in the blueprint process. So this is just kind of another tool in that toolbox as well.
Yeah.
The blueprint project is working real hard to identify recharge areas of recharge and multi-benefit, with habitat. So that's been their focus.
You just mentioned recharge, Deanna, that just popped in my head that we probably should have told the group about the AEM project.
Yes, go ahead.
So Deanna and I and several of the other GSA managers participated in a call a couple of weeks back with DWR. They are going to be going through and doing that aerial electromagnetic surveys that they, and this is all being paid for through funding that DWR has. They're doing an 8x12 grid in the Tule subbasin, including Kern and Tulare Lake, are one of the places that they're going to be starting. And so sometime, after October, we don't have an exact date or, exact schedule just yet. They're going to be flying over this area, just so that you're all aware. Tom Harder and I actually sat down and took a look at the proposed flight plan that they had. This was very, very preliminary. We made some modifications, or asked for some modifications, I should say, in certain areas, and included some other, what we thought might be some important areas for them to fly, including some of the boundary conditions. And, we're all, want to make sure that, as we start to line these models up and everything else, that we understand what's going on at some of those boundaries. So there are, that flight should take place, like I said, sometime after October, and they expect to have the data to us sometime mid-year in 22. So it's not something we're going to get right away, but there's at least in the upper aquifer, in that top 1,000 feet or so, they've said that they can get some cross sections and other information on all the clay sections that do exist. Part of this is to identify some near surface recharge that we might be able to do in some recharge areas, and that's when Deanna said the word recharge, I was like, oh wait, we should probably mention this as well. So it might be helpful on the subsidence issues as well. Unfortunately, we won't have this data probably before our responses are due back to DWR on the GSP. So it may be something that we'll have to incorporate into the 5-year update. All right, Deanna, I am taking up a lot of time on my stuff today, but
I think we pretty much covered it for today. So our next meeting will be August 25th. I think we will try to have a little bit more on the land repurposing available, and we'll probably have a couple points we'll hit on water market trading, and I will send out to the group, to all the landowners that attend, the 5-year versus 1 year of sustainable yield allocation, maybe some perspective changes to the policy, some language, and get some opinions back on that. So if you could think through that again, if we're going to do that, I'd like to have that done before the end of the year, because I think we'll be locked in after that. But that will be something that we're going to be looking for. So.
Yeah, and I think we talked about the projects. You mentioned the Allensworth project, and where we're at with that, Deanna, and I think the only other item, Angela Water District is pursuing some projects on their own. That's the district projects, but we are open and anxious to have more discussions with all of you about potential projects and what the GSA can do to help you, whether it's policy to make to make projects attractive, or incentives, something along those lines. or be a partner or be more actively involved, be a technical partner, whatever the role the GSA can play for each of you on the call. That's what we're looking for. And we're still very anxious to get, anything that you guys might think is a project worth considering. Let us know, because, like I said, the GSA can be helpful. We can maybe help with the funding mechanisms. Maybe we can help with some of the planning issues, just a letter of support, whatever it is that your project might need from the GSA. And the whole idea on some of the projects, we're still looking at ways to try and bring in some additional surface water supplies to that southeast area. And I'm going to say it again, we are still looking for help in trying to figure out how we're going to wheel that water down to the southeast area. And there's still with the ALPA, we still have those issues with ALPA ID, and are still looking for some ideas from the stakeholders and the growers who might be interested in pursuing that a little bit more. So, let us know. I don't want to leave this call without at least bringing up this topic one more time about the projects. We're anxious for any projects that you might have to help you and get them onto the website so that we can, potentially look at them for some funding mechanisms as well.
Amir, just to leave you with a little bit of optimism. I'm hopeful that everybody's thinking about projects of what we can do, but I'm sure that as we finalize kind of crediting and what that looks like, people can actually run numbers on what a project might cost, or really understand kind of the feasibility of these ideas and take it from pie in the sky to like, hey, let's build this, we can make it work, and here's who we need to talk to, and here's how we can coordinate. So hopefully, once we get through the crediting and those discussions, maybe more projects will surface, although, well, I think we all know they're somewhat limited out there.
Yes. Yes to everything you just said, Molly. You're right. Ultimately, it comes down to the value of that water. And we certainly recognize that as well. But we do want to make sure that as you're considering some of these, if you're still in a very preliminary planning stage, without going into even details with us, if there are changes or modifications to our policies and incentive programs that might make projects more attractive, that's what we're hoping that you can kind of help point some of those out, and we can make sure that those at least get considered by the board.
Yeah, well, Tri-County's leaving some policy really open, because we're hopeful that upstream private entities will develop projects that downstream landowners can be a component of, and we'll build the policy around that. We will not do something that would hinder that. So, we're kind of hoping that landowners will drive the process a little bit in opening some of those policies up.
And that's much appreciated. I was just trying to throw in some optimism that we'll get some creativity coming through. I'm racking my brain all the time.
And that's appreciated too.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
But thanks for the clarification, Deanna.
No problem. And again, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. And we're going to keep working on this. It seems like slow progress, but we have been making progress in these areas, and we're working with others within both subbasins to address these issues. And as they come forward, we'll bring them back to this committee. And we appreciate the input. So thank you, everybody. And August 25th, 10 a.m. We'll go over the next step.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Thank you all.
All right. See ya. Take care. Bye.